Hi guys, so this is the video version of what we would have had for class to talk about micro and preventative medicine in connection with the Health Promotions Week. So this presentation is going to have elements talking about the normal human microbiome, what happens when you disrupt that, and then we're going to completely change gears, talk about different types of vaccines and normal vaccine schedules, what happens when you have vaccination lapses in the population, predictably you have disease outbreaks, and then finally I'll do a little bit about discussing vaccines with your patients. There are several links in this PowerPoint presentation that if we were doing this live action would have been opened and discussed and whatnot, but this file will be posted on Blackboard, and so if you're interested, will be able to open those links and see what types of information your patients are likely bombarded with. Okay, so the human microbiome. Basically, this is a catch-all term meaning all of the population of microorganisms that live in, on, and among humans. This has been extraordinarily better characterized in recent years because of a field of work called metagenomics, meaning it's become quite easy and cheap to do massive amounts of high-throughput DNA sequencing, and so we now know more about what lives in the human intestinal tract, the human oral cavity, human vaginal cavity, than we ever have before. And the majority of these organisms we can't grow in culture. And so prior to these types of studies, we really did not know what was going on in there. One thing that became quite clear from these studies is that there really isn't a human microbiome. The gut microbiome looks quite different from the vaginal, which looks quite different from the oral, which looks quite different from the skin. But from individual to individual and geographic area to geographic area, there's quite a bit of diversity. So in the actual file, this guy right here is hyperlinked, so you'd, sorry about that, be able to actually look at it, open it if you're interested in it. It's a very cool interactive site that's constantly updated with new sequence information if that sort of thing interests you. So some of the things that the microbiome actually does is that it aids in digestion, it aids in regulation of pH. There is increasing amounts of evidence that it's critically important for immune regulation, but the mechanism of things like immune regulation and disease prevention are really in their infancy. And so we're just starting to understand mechanistically how that works, but right now, most of the studies that are done have been descriptive in nature as opposed to really understanding what's going on in a very thorough way. So just to add this guy into the mix, this is an image which in this particular app is cut off a bit, but you can see the entire thing in the PowerPoint slide. Let me move this and center it a little bit. But what you can see in this regard is that when you're looking at a human dorsal and ventral, and you're looking at all of these different areas of the body, here versus here, everything else, that there's quite a bit of diversity in terms of which microorganisms you actually have present. So you have all these guys that are color-coded, and then you've got pie charts for proportion of how much of them are where in your body. So we are actually quite a complex zoo, if you like. Okay, so in recent years, as I mentioned, there's quite a bit of there have been quite a bit of studies that look at alterations in the gut, vaginal, skin, whatever microbiome, and what types of pathologies can result from that. But the take-home message here is that this is a science in its infancy, and to insist that we understand exactly what's going on at this point is not really appropriate. But that being said, keep watching for new studies on this. This is a very rapidly changing and expanding field, and should therapies arise that have been strongly validated by peer-reviewed literature, they could be quite helpful to your patients. Okay, so now I want to talk about 3 microbiome alteration related diseases that we actually do understand the mechanisms of, because they're quite straightforward in this case. The first and second are on this particular slide, and the first one we've actually met before. This is Candida vulvovaginitis, so a garden variety yeast infection, if you like. So you've seen this image before, and what we saw in this image is that the more Candida you have, so if this is if this is a bar graph with a y-axis here, x-axis here, this is time, this is the number of cells in the population. If you have a lot of Candida, you have very little lactobacillus. If you have a lot of lactobacillus, you have very little Candida. The actual mechanism for this is quite straightforward, and the mechanism involves pH. So lactobacilli are the primary inhabitants of the vaginal cavity. They're proportionally the most common microorganism that is seen there, and they ferment lactose and produce lactic acid. So when they are there in their appropriate proportion, they keep the vaginal pH quite low. So again, if this is number of organisms, and on this scale now you have pH, if you have a lot of lactobacilli, you have a low pH. If you have very few lactobacilli, the pH kicks upward toward neutral, and then you have a more favorable environment for certain microorganisms to grow. So if you have a loss of lactobacilli, you have an alkaline shift in pH. If you have a lot of lactobacilli, you lose the alkaline shift and you have an acidic pH. When you have an acidic pH, Candida albicans stays at very low levels. Gardnerella vaginalis, which is our second disease, which hopefully we remember is associated with bacterial vaginosis, these two organisms are at low levels when the pH is low and the lactobacillus population is high. If the lactobacillus population drops and is low, alkaline shift in the pH, which goes towards, at that point, goes towards neutral. This is far more favorable for Candida and Gardnerella to grow to inappropriate proportions, and then you start having clinical disease, which is, again, vulvovaginitis in the case of Candida and bacterial vaginosis in the case of Gardnerella. Okay, the other microbiome alteration-induced disease that we wanted to talk about is becoming an incredibly significant problem in hospitals. And this is a disease called pseudomembranous colitis in association with a bacterium called Clostridium difficile. You might have heard of it referred to as C. diff. So the way that this situation works, the way that this pathology works, if you look here, this is kind of normal intestinal tract following a colonoscopy. This is what happens when you have a development of pseudomembranous colitis. You have all of these incredibly painful, inflammatory, pus-filled plaques on the surface. And so we have a nice kind of diagrammatic description of this here. If you have Clostridium difficile colonizing the direct surface of the intestinal epithelium, they release toxins, which are, by the way, AB5 toxins and ADP ribosylating toxins, just for fun. The intestinal epithelium has a lot of destruction to it. Hopefully remember mechanistically how that happens. And then what begins to occur is that you have this massive inflammatory response in the colonic epithelium, and in an attempt to contain this and and resolve the infection, you have the ultimate development of intense inflammatory infiltrates, and finally a nice pseudomembrane. So this right here corresponds to these plaques right here. How this actually happens is very much antibiotic related. And so the thing to keep in mind is C. diff in and of itself is not necessarily a pathogenic organism. About 50% of us carry it in our intestinal tract as normal flora without having a problem. Part of that is perhaps due to the presence or absence of the toxin genes, these guys right down here, that are going to mediate this destruction. But another part of that is simply due to the fact that we have a very healthy population of microorganisms that are physically covering the intestinal epithelium directly. C. diff tends to be out near the lumen of the colon, so these organisms would be physically separated from the intestinal epithelium by the normal microbiota. So what does this have to do with antibiotics is that if you have a lot of normal flora, again imagining this is an x-axis with number of bacteria on it, if you have a long-term antibiotic use, and long-term can be months or it can be as short as 3 to 4 weeks, you have a loss of the normal microorganisms because they too are susceptible to antibiotics. And then what you have here on this green line is a growth in organisms that are able to survive antibiotic therapy, such as C. diff. So C. diff isn't inherently necessarily resistant to antibiotics. The reason it can survive is that it forms endospores. We talked briefly about these several weeks ago, but just as a reminder, endospores are these small particles that contain genomic DNA in a very carefully constructed coat of keratin, basically. And so they're incredibly resistant to desiccation and destruction, and they're not actively growing, they're a dormant state. And so actively growing C. diff would be killed off by antibiotics, such as everything else in the colon, but the spores are able to germinate and come back. And so C. diff winds up growing following spore germination at the direct surface of the epithelium, and they grow to proportions that they normally would not be at. And so when that happens, you have the development of this type of pathology. C. diff is becoming incredibly common in hospital settings because many of the patients, particularly in ICU units, are on continuous antibiotics, and they have an incredible loss of normal flora. And even if those individual patients were not originally C. diff carriers, when they enter the hospital ecosystem, they're far more likely to become infected with it. And so this organism right now is something that you will almost certainly see on clinical rotation, and it is almost certain to cause you several headaches throughout life. That being said, there is an experimental toxoid vaccine based on these toxins right here. We'll talk about what toxoid vaccines are in a minute, that actually looks very promising in clinical trials. So hopefully in a few years, maybe this will not be such a problem for you. But for you lot, you certainly will see it on clinical rotation. So the next question that we tend to hear a lot about in the popular press, if nothing else, is can the microbiome be altered to cure disease? So people talk a lot about taking probiotic supplements, and if you're on antibiotics, you should definitely eat yogurt to prevent a yeast infection, and all of these kinds of stories that we all hear, and perhaps some of us do, to maintain and support health. That is that it's very complicated, to say the least. Many peer-reviewed studies have shown that taking probiotic supplements really does not recolonize the intestinal tract as we might hope that it would. That being said, there does seem to be an ameliorative effect on the inflammatory response of taking these organisms, even though they don't permanently colonize. They're there transiently at best. And so the mechanisms of that are just wildly speculative. Nobody knows how that works. The fact is, if we are looking at this from a clinical perspective, if it helps, that's great. If it doesn't help, there's no purpose in doing it. So that being said, there have been some very nicely controlled studies that I put the abstracts up of here, and what these are showing is that if you have C. diff infection specifically, if you try to supplement with a particular species of yeast, again, this is not yeast as in Candida, which would be pathogenic in this situation. This is Saccharomyces yeast. This is actually brewer's yeast, and this does seem to be quite helpful in terms of minimizing C. diff pathology, but again, the mechanism is not real clear. Candida vulvovaginitis, there is some evidence that it is helpful to take yogurt to prevent this. However, one thing has to be very clearly stated to patients is that this is not ingestion of yogurt in the normal sense. This is topical application of yogurt. So in other words, this is taking yogurt and applying it into the vaginal cavity. There is good evidence that you can reseed lactobacilli into the vaginal cavity, but doing so is, I imagine, quite, I don't know, messy, unpleasant, whatever else. Finally, the thing that I think that should be brought up is there's a growing movement toward a procedure called fecal transplant. And that is, unfortunately, exactly what it sounds like. This is where you have a donor who's got a normal, healthy microbiome. They donate fecal material. It's freeze-dried, put into capsule form, and then that is actually taken orally by an individual that is in need of a normal, healthy microbiome. So this has been done for C. diff patients. This has also been done for Crohn's patients, and there have been some reports of it being done for autistic patients. There have been a couple of studies showing that there's altered gut microbiomes. In fact, I believe I had an abstract of one several slides back. This does seem to be the case, but whether that alteration is somehow causative of autism or contributive to autism, or is simply somehow an effect thereof, is really not understood well. So this, again, fecal transplant is something to keep your eye on for new studies, but the mechanism and overall effectiveness is quite hotly debated. Okay. So now we're going to pause for a moment, if you like, and when you resume the video, we're going to be talking about immunization. Okay, pause, resume, however you want to do that. One thing I just want to point out quickly is that immunization and vaccination are not necessarily interchangeable terms, even though we tend to use them that way. Immunization means creation of immunity, and it can be done actively or passively. And I have an example up here where you can do clinical administration of both a vaccine, which is going to give you an active immunization. That would be this right here. You immunize somebody with rabies antigen, which is just killed rabies virus, and they make their own antibodies. Or you can passively immunize them, which is you give them rabies gamma globulin or purified IgG from that is going to neutralize rabies. So this is something you would give to a person who's been bitten by a rabid animal. This is something you would give to a person who is at high risk for being bitten by a rabid animal, such as a vet or a farmer or something. Passive immunization, again, is something you would give to someone who has already been bitten, so that those antibodies that you administer to them are going to absorb and soak up any viable rabies virus that is present. That being said, this is a medical example. The far and away the most common method of passive immunization is breastfeeding. So IgA, IgG are both secreted in breast milk, and they're passed on to infants during the active nursing. And so there's some circulating immunity from mothers that can be passed on to infants. Okay, so I have this image here that I really like, that talks about different types of immunization in terms of passive and active. And it does it like a phylogenetic tree, which if anybody knows anything about me personally, you would see why that would appeal to me, because I have a background in systematics. But that being said, if we were to look at passive immunization for a minute, you would have this idea of immune serum globulin, which is, in this case, something there you can give whole serum from another person or an animal to a person who may or may not be infected. So I know that sounded like a lot of word salad, but there are two good examples of this to bring up. The equine one is tetanus serum, and this is still used in many countries. If a person is exposed to tetanus, they will actually give whole horse serum. Horses carry Clostridium tetani as normal flora. It doesn't seem to hurt them, and so nearly all horses are immune to tetanus, and they have circulating antibodies to the organism, and so that can be a last-ditch treatment for someone who's been exposed to tetanus. A more popular example that we all might have heard about on the news just last year is human serum globulin donation, and this was done during the Ebola epidemic in 2014. Specifically in the United States, Dr. Kent Brantley, who was the physician who was brought back from Liberia and was the first human patient to be treated for Ebola on U.S. soil, he survived the infection, and then when the two nurses in Dallas were infected from a patient who died in their hospital, he actually gave both of them serum blood donations as they were hospitalized with Ebola themselves, and then they both recovered. As to whether or not that's why they recovered or simply that they had better supportive care, it's not clear right now. Certainly that's an N of 2, so nobody can make a claim that worked, but it certainly it certainly is something to think about. Specific immunoglobulins, the rabies gamma globulin would be a great example. So that's not just whole serum shot into a person from an infected animal. That's actually engineered, cleaned up, purified immunoglobulins. The third one would be monoclonal antibodies. So the most commonly known monoclonal antibody that is used in passive immunization is actually not against an infectious agent at all. It's actually against breast cancer cells. The drug Herceptin is actually a monoclonal antibody, and it neutralizes a protein on certain types of breast cancer called HER2/neu, and it's actually kind of a neat mechanism of treating cancer. Okay. That being said, that's passive immunization. Active immunization is what we do far more commonly. We can break this into, I'm going to say, 2 categories. There are such things as DNA vaccines. There are none that are approved for clinical use because they do not work as well as these other 2, frankly. Okay, so for inactivated vaccines, these are vaccines that have no infectious agent in them whatsoever. Let me say that again for anyone in the cheap seats, because your patients are going to bring this up repeatedly. An inactivated vaccine has no infectious agents. You cannot get sick from it. Those fall into the category of being killed vaccines. So you take the infectious agent, it's treated in some way, either with heat, with formalin, with whatever mechanism. That is cleaned up and removed from the vaccine preparation. Then you have an inactivated infectious agent or component, and that is then injected into a person. The reason I'm saying this so carefully is because there are many reports of vaccines containing formaldehyde, and that's where that comes from, the idea that certain killed vaccines are killed by formalin fixation. That is absolutely true, but it's not like you grow up some flu virus, you add formalin, and then you shoot it in a person. You obviously go through several purification steps to remove any of that. The other reason I was being so emphatic about killed vaccines is that there's this urban legend that refuses to die, that the flu shot gives you the flu. It's killed. Anybody who says that, one of two things have happened to them or their cousin that they know or whatever. Either they were already infected with flu before they got the flu shot and just hadn't started displaying symptoms yet. Flu's got about a 36 to 72 hour incubation period, so you don't get sick right away if you're infected. Or they simply have a fever, a reactionary fever from a vaccine, and equate that with getting the flu. Not the case in either regard. Okay, so that being said, there is a live flu vaccine. That's the flu mist one that shot up your nose. That is a live vaccine, but it does not commonly cause influenza unless you're dealing with an immunocompromised person. An immunocompromised person, however, should get the killed one anyway. All right, now that rant aside, subunit vaccines are also a good choice. These, the ones that we usually see in the clinic would be toxoid vaccines. So that would be the most commonly used ones are the tetanus vaccine, and toxoid is also down here for subunit. Other subunits could be just purified protein vaccines and purified antigen vaccines. The acellular pertussis is a good example of that. This last guy that I want to talk about are peptide and polysaccharide vaccines. So we have a few of these that actually work really well right now. A peptide vaccine is where a bunch of people did a lot of studies and realized what the most immunogenic protein in a certain pathogen was, and then they picked out certain peptides, which are really short sequences of protein, about 10 to 12, sometimes up to 20 amino acids. So they're really very short fragments, and they found some that are very protective, elicit a strong immune response, and neutralize infectious agents. The most commonly used one that we have now is the hepatitis B vaccine. It seems to work brilliantly well, which is fantastic. There are also a couple of polysaccharide vaccines we've actually talked very briefly about already. One of them was the strep pneumo vaccine. So polysaccharide vaccines are usually limited to capsular antigens. And so we spoke about this with strep pneumo and how the polysaccharide vaccine that we used actually is only protective against certain serogroups, and others exist that are not protected because their capsular antigens are quite different and they're not in the vaccine preparation. The other one that's commonly used is the Hib vaccine. The Haemophilus influenza type B vaccine works really well also. Okay, so those are our inactivated vaccines. Once again, if anyone missed it, any of these vaccines cannot give you the associated disease. It is not possible. There is no live infectious agent. Okay. Can you tell that point bugs me? All right, so now to go to live vaccines, live immunization. Attenuated mutants make great vaccines, okay? And there are different ways of attenuating infectious agents. You can adapt them to cold temperature, meaning that they only like growing at, say, 32 to 35 degrees Celsius. Our bodies are 37, so when you put them in, when you inject them into a 37-degree person, they no longer are adapted to survive there. You can genetically manipulate certain mutants. There's some commercial veterinary vaccines that work this way. We don't have any that are, unless I'm forgetting something, we don't have any that are used for humans right now in a standard vaccine panel. This one right here I want to point out because there was some exciting news about this probably about a month ago. The first hybrid virus vaccine that's been applied on large scale and is very shortly going to be available is the new VZV Ebola vaccine. These large-scale ring vaccination trials were done in Guinea over the past 6 months, and it actually seemed like it worked quite well. So when we say hybrid virus, what we mean by that is that a carrier virus is generated. In the case of this Ebola vaccine, it's a varicella zoster virus acting as a carrier, and you take out the genes that are very specific for VZV virulence that would make it cause chickenpox. And what you do instead is that you put in the surface antigens from Ebola virus. And that then becomes, when you actually produce the virus in a laboratory, it's a chimera of VZV and Ebola. It's neither VZV nor is it Ebola. That then is used to vaccinate people, and they seem to seroconvert and make a nice T-cell response, and at this point have been 100% protected from Ebola. So that's great news. This would be the first, I would say, the first genetically manipulated, commonly used live vaccine. I didn't mention it over here because, first of all, I wanted to mention it here, but also I want to point out that this is not part of a standard panel right now. This is experimental, but it seems extraordinarily promising. That being said, it's not likely to become part of a standard U.S. panel because we are not likely in the U.S. to encounter an Ebola patient. It might become part of a military panel, but I could not imagine it at this in this day and age being part of a standard U.S. panel, because our risk of being exposed is so low. All right. Of course, the other way that one develops immunity to an infectious agent is to be infected with a virulent strain, actually get sick, and then recover. So in this case, this is the ultimate active immunization, because you are actually fighting the real thing and recovering on your own. All right, so we want to be very clear that we know the difference between passive and active. We want to be very clear on how live vaccines work, how they are different from inactivated vaccines. You want to know the subtypes of inactivated vaccines, except this one. Don't worry about this. And I would like it very much if everybody knew examples of each one. And in particular, what is the standard vaccine panel that we give in the U.S., and what are each type of vaccine? Okay, so that's what we're thinking we're going to be held responsible for. All right, so now I'm going to go through some of our different panels, some ways to think about this, and what are the risks, benefits, who's live, who's inactivated, blah, blah, blah. Okay, so the first thing I want to talk about are whole cell vaccines. So these are the entire infectious agent, not just a subunit piece of it. We have some live ones of these, we have some inactivated ones of these. Okay, so once again, the idea of how is something attenuated. You can adapt it to cold, you can make it, another way of looking at that is you can make it temperature sensitive. You can adapt it to cell culture so that when you then put it back into a human whose cells are quite different from cultured cells, it's no longer able to bind properly, replicate efficiently, et cetera, et cetera. Okay. A great example of that would be the yellow fever vaccine. So this is a live virus vaccine. It's not something that we give as a standard, but it is something that, first of all, I believe at this point all military personnel still get. But if you travel to an area of the world where yellow fever is common, it is strongly recommended that you be vaccinated. And in fact, there are several countries that you have to present a international yellow vaccine card. Sorry, yellow is not related to yellow fever. It's just called a yellow card, but it's your immunization card. And you have to demonstrate proof that you have been vaccinated against yellow fever, or they will deny you admission into the country. See, this is great when it's live because I actually bring my yellow card in to let people look at if they want to. Many of you, I'm sure, probably have your own. Anyway, the risks and benefits to whole cell live attenuated organisms are as follows. The risk is, of course, this is a live infectious agent. If you have any underlying immune system, situation that you are not aware of, you're at risk for developing the disease. If you share a household with somebody who is immunocompromised, and I include in that someone who is elderly or a newborn baby, you are at risk of shedding live virus that is not dangerous to you, but could be dangerous to them. So that's something to keep in mind. However, the benefits of live attenuated immunizations is that you tend to have lifelong immunity. The immunity that is generated is far more robust. And so this is the best protection you can possibly get. But it does come with a slight risk. Okay, so inactivated vaccines, we already talked about this. The idea that they're most commonly inactivated with some kind of fixative, usually formaldehyde. And so that would be the how. The risks of this are very low. The risks and the side effects tend to include fever, simply because you're injecting a lot of foreign substance, and often you have something called an adjuvant mixed in with it. An adjuvant is something that's going to stimulate a strong immune response. So that, in many cases, leads to a fever, but it lasts about a day, and it is not going to cause any long-term damage. The benefits of this are that you have protection from an infectious agent without ever encountering a live infectious agent, which is great. You can't shed it onto anybody else. You can't possibly get the disease from it. It's very safe in that regard. The other cost to this is that the immunity raised by inactivated vaccines tends to be slightly less robust than that of a live vaccine. Okay, so subunit vaccines, once again, we already spoke about this on the phylogenetic tree of immunizations slide, but peptide vaccines are very smartly designed. You take an entire protein sequence that you notice infected people raise an immune response to. You look at the small pieces of it that are most immunogenic, and you synthesize these in a laboratory. You mix them, you add, in many cases, you add an adjuvant to them, and you shoot them into a person. So I mentioned hepatitis V, Gardasil's the other big one. Again, these, by definition, do not and cannot contain any infectious agent because these are purely synthetic. They're made in a laboratory by a very carefully calibrated machine. There is no possibility of becoming infected with Hep B or HPV by getting this vaccine. Very low risk. The benefits are extraordinarily high. You have protection against hepatitis B, which, as we discussed before, ultimately down the line can lead to cirrhosis and liver cancer. You have protection against HPV, which can lead to not only, we tend to think of it as cervical cancer prevention, but HPV is also, as a reminder, associated with head and neck cancers and with penile cancer and other types. So, oral cancers. And so you have protection with very low risk here. Polysaccharide vaccines, again, usually you're talking about protection against capsular antigens. So this would be, this is a strep right here. This is its capsule around it. And again, the two that we spoke about were Haemophilus B and strep pneumo. The one that we hadn't brought up yet is the meningococcal vaccine. So Neisseria meningitidis has a nice capsule around it, same as Haemophilus, same as strep pneumo, and it's got a very nicely immunogenic set of capsular antigens. So that's how this vaccine works as well. So basically, polysaccharide vaccines, the three big ones that we use in the U.S. are protective against 3 agents of meningitis. And so they're something that is very important to recommend to your patients. At this point in time, the meningococcal vaccine is only recommended for individuals 12 and above. I think that recommendation is likely to change in the next 5 to 10 years, so keep listening for this one to be quite different. It's also recommended for people who are traveling to particularly North Africa. There's an incredibly high density of meningitis cases there. It's called the meningitis belt. So it's also a travel vaccine. Okay, who gets which vaccines? Again, we have the common childhood series. That would be your pertussis, your diphtheria, your tetanus, polio, measles, mumps, rubella, all those guys that are causing diseases that we think about, as something that we don't ever see anymore, except that now we see them again because of vaccine lapses. The childhood series at this point now includes varicella zoster, so protection against chickenpox. It also includes Haemophilus influenza B. It also includes hepatitis B. One question that is often brought up is why an infant needs to be vaccinated against hepatitis B when they can't possibly engage in any of the activities that are commonly associated with Hep B transmission. So that would be unprotected sex and IV drug use. The problem there is that Hep B is also can be congenitally acquired by infants from an infected mother, and it's also shed in other bodily fluids. And so if you've ever seen daycare kids, particularly those under the age of 3, they drool, they chew their fingers, they slime all over the toys, and then one kid goes and picks up a toy that some kid just drooled on or bled on or whatever else. And so even though small children are not usually party to the types of activities we usually think about for Hep B transmission, that is absolutely a fallacious argument to say that small children are in no way at risk. And so, by the way, I'm pointing these out so that in the future, when you're talking with your patients, you have a good counter answer to when these questions are asked. Okay. At-risk populations this is where you want to talk with your patients about vaccinating if they are at certain risk for certain things. This, in many cases, applies to elderly patients. So it's absolutely recommended that the elderly get a seasonal flu shot and a seasonal periodic pneumovax vaccine. Pneumonia in elderly patients is an extraordinarily high cause of death, cause of complication, cause of loss of independence, and so many cases of pneumonia are quite easily prevented with these vaccines. In addition, the elderly are at elevated risk because of declining immunity to varicella zoster reactivation and the development of shingles. And so now we have a nice recommended VZV booster that is designed to prevent shingles development. Okay, so you have certain patient populations that are also at risk. If you have a patient who is asthmatic, it is absolutely essential they get an annual flu vaccine. an asthmatic patient is far more likely to have extreme complications of influenza infection than a patient who's not asthmatic. If you have a patient with hepatitis C, the last thing you want is to have them contracting hepatitis B or hepatitis A to compound their situation. And so if they have not been vaccinated for either of these, it's important that they are. In addition, you have people who are at risk because of travel. And so again, I mentioned yellow fever a minute ago. I mentioned the meningitis belt a minute ago. But additional vaccines that would fall in this category would be the typhoid vaccine and the hepatitis A vaccine if people are traveling to endemic areas. Okay, so talking about vaccine lapses leading to reemergence of certain diseases, in many cases that happens because of collapses in infrastructure. And this is not something that is anybody's fault in terms of parents and their patients, and it's actually quite devastating because these are preventable problems, and you had patients who very much want to be vaccinated, but they can't get to a clinic, or all of the aid workers that might be in charge of administering vaccines might have been evacuated from a country. It's actually quite a terrible situation. So in recent memory, there have been a fair number of polio outbreaks in areas of the world that there didn't used to be polio. And one of the issues with that is that it's completely infrastructure related. As of now, there are 3 countries in the world that we think of as having natural circulating polio virus. They are Pakistan, Afghanistan, and Nigeria. So once again, Pakistan, Afghanistan, Nigeria. And what happens is that we are seeing satellite outbreaks, usually in association with travel from one of those 3 countries, that if you get individuals who are infected from one of those places coming to a place where there's been a lapse in vaccination because of infrastructure problems, then you suddenly have a susceptible population and you wind up with polio outbreaks. So this has happened, again, several times in the past few years, where we had an outbreak that lasted probably 2 or 3 years, starting in 2012, right here. So you had cases in Kenya, Ethiopia, and Somalia, and what happened here was that you had Al-Shabaab fighters in Somalia that were recruiting fighters from Nigeria and from Boko Haram. So these guys came over here, joined these forces, they started fighting, and because Somalia has had terrible infrastructure problems for quite some time, they had a very low level of immunization in the population, and so we started seeing polio cases in Somalia because the borders between particularly Somalia and Ethiopia are not particularly well patrolled. This is the Somali-Ethiopian border at one particular crossing. It's a rope, which is kind of awesome. Awesome in a really bad way. So you had people crossing over. See, this guy's in the act right now. And many of these guys were either unvaccinated or infected, crossing into Ethiopia, which has a higher vaccine prevalence, but not certainly not at herd immunity threshold. And then you had cases in Ethiopia. And then some of those guys crossed over into Kenya. In addition to that, we had kind of a similar situation where you had Al-Shabaab fighters leave Somalia, were recruited to go fight in Syria. And Syria, as we all are currently painfully aware, is having quite a terrible infrastructure situation right now. So things like routine vaccinations have really fallen by the wayside, understandably so. And so 2 years ago, you had fighters go from here to here, and perhaps predictably, you had quite a large outbreak of polio in Syria. There's another nice historical example of this, and what happened was that at the fall of the Soviet Union, you had, again, an infrastructural collapse. So these right here are rates of diphtheria in the Soviet Union, where they had a certain infrastructure in place, and there was a high level of vaccinations. As the country collapsed, that fell off, and then predictably you started having spikes in diphtheria cases. Once again, this is our image of our diphtheria patient, that kind of necrotic pharyngitis. As things kind of settled down and you have kind of the current Russian government, vaccination rates went back up, diphtheria cases went back down. So it's very predictable that when you have lapses in immunization, you have a population that can no longer sustain its herd immunity, and the second an infected person walks in, you start having cases of things that you wouldn't normally expect to have cases of. Okay, so that where we have vaccine lapses that are secondary to elective omission. I try really hard to redact the opinion, but I'm sure you can imagine what the opinion is of me, by me, from me, whatever. So basically, we have a very similar situation for certain diseases. I've used the term herd immunity a few times. I believe Dr. Morganelli has perhaps brought this up to you, but basically this is the level of immunity that's required in a population in order to make it difficult for a certain infectious agent to spread. So if you think about it, the herd immunity threshold is typically thought of as about 95-96%. If you have 95 people in a crowd and 5 of them are not immune to a certain infectious agent, and then you have one person wander into the crowd who is infected, the majority of their interactions are going to be with people who are immune to their infectious agent. So that those people who were exposed are not then going to turn around and spread it to somebody who's not exposed. Okay, so that's the concept of herd immunity. The idea of the majority of the population not being susceptible is protective to those in the population who are not immune. All right, so that being said, our magic cutoff here is about 95-96%. So when enough people start declining to be immunized, because whatever their reasons are, you start dropping below the herd immunity threshold. So herd immunity is often used as a counter argument for why someone should be, why it's okay to decline vaccination. And this is again more or less a fallacious point, because that 5% of the population, normally we as a medical community try to think of that as being more or less reserved for people who, for whatever medical reason, cannot be immunized, or somebody who is not old enough to be immunized. This is a particularly sensitive issue for someone like myself who has small children. That we had this outbreak of measles in 2 falls ago, where we had many measles cases in the Northeast, in New York and in Boston, and then there were satellite cases in San Francisco. I had a spouse who rode mass transit into Boston every day, and I had a 2-month-old infant who was not old enough to be immunized against measles. And every day I thought about the measles particles that could be clinging to my husband's jacket when he got home and picked the baby up. And that's, so that 5% really is not something to be played with. That's for individuals in the population who are not eligible for vaccination by their own, by their age or by some underlying medical condition. And so that being said, the other counter-argument you sometimes hear about herd immunity is that, well, I looked up the website and it said the United States is at herd immunity, so I don't have to worry. Also a fallacious argument. The United States as a whole, for most vaccine-preventable illnesses, is at herd immunity. But the United States, geographically speaking, is a very big place. And so you have many, many, many parts of the country that are well above that threshold, that are in the 98, 99% level. But you have other parts of the country where you have a lot of elective omission that is well below that. California is one, and surprise, the Northeast is another. And so for certain immunizations, if you go onto the main CDC website, we are at 75% coverage, which means that we are at risk at the moment for measles outbreaks and pertussis outbreaks in particular. And that is something to be very cautious about. It's something that you, as when you go in the clinic, you want to be on the lookout for, but it's also something that's important to emphasize to your patients. So speaking, this is a difficult thing because your patients are laypersons, and your patients are in many cases parents and spouses and people who are, exposed to these just really quite emotionally wrenching websites and discussion boards and everything else. And sorry, that was my cat stepping on the iPad. That's what those lasers were. Please ignore that. And so I love it when I'm making a really emotional point and my friggin' cat steps on the iPad. That's wonderful. Anyway, the point here is that your patients or your patient's parents are exposed to some incredibly emotive and persuasive arguments in their viewpoint frequently. So you see things like this too. So not only do you have emotional pleas about hurting your small children, but you have things like this that are snarky and sarcastic, and they sound like this is a very valid point. And so that's why I put snarky asterisk comments back. But if somebody has this shared on their Instagram account or their Twitter feed or their Facebook page, it's like, wait, if they don't cause autism, why is it listed as a side effect? Oh my God, this whole thing might be real. And then the problem with this is that they don't. This is not true. This is fallacious. But to an average person, are they really going to go back and fact check that? Maybe, maybe not. So it's difficult to talk with your patients about immunizations, particularly if you, like myself, feel very passionately about this topic. But the problem is we have to keep in mind that these are not people who are trying to be difficult. These are not people who are trying to make bad health decisions. They simply think they are making good health decisions. And it's very difficult to convince someone otherwise. So that being said, how do you do that? How do you deal with this? So unfortunately, many studies have shown now, the more you take somebody who's making invalid arguments and saying something that is not fact-based or verified by studies, the more you try to present them with hard evidence, the more stuck in that opinion they actually get, which is really wild. But that has been confirmed by multiple studies. So I've got actually a link to this on the PowerPoint slide. So basically the question then becomes, what the heck do you do? We're scientists, right? So that's what we do. When we want to make an opinion, we say, let me look for a study and see what the evidence says. But not all of your patients are scientists or clinicians. And again, many of them have read some very scary things about immunizations. And so what do? So there's a couple of really nice case models for how to actually approach the conversation. The very worst thing you can do is say something condescending or make your patients feel like you're not taking their concerns seriously, because there's an entire community on the internet machine that makes it seem like they are taking their concerns seriously. So being dismissive is the absolute worst thing we can be. But we try, I think that some of the best approaches that have been demonstrated are to talk with your patients and Make it seem like you know where they're coming from. And when they say, well, I heard there's formaldehyde in vaccines, say, oh yeah, let me tell you where that comes from, okay? It's actually that the original preparations are treated with formaldehyde, but I promise it's extensively removed and blah, blah, blah. So what you did there was you took someone's fear, something that they read about as being reality, and said, oh yeah, there's a grain of truth in that, but here's the actual situation. It makes it look like you took their concerns seriously, and you told them, oh, that's not an outright lie. There's a grain of truth in that, but it somehow got confused along the way, and here's what the actual message is. And that approach seems to actually be quite effective. So this is definitely a difficult thing, but it's something that it's critically important to get right for your patients. Okay, that being said, I will see you sometime soon, and I hope you enjoyed my goofy video. Talk to you later. Bye, guys.